Good evening. How are you? Week 11. Let's get into it. A little housekeeping to start, like always. The church visitation papers, I want to just clear something up. I'm sure you clearly saw my announcement on Wednesday because of the flurry of emails that followed. Those of you who picked Greenhouse, I didn't necessarily want to scare you off. After getting 5 out of 7, I said maybe some people might want to change it up. If you don't want to change it up, that's fine. You can do Greenhouse. You can do St. Augustine's, which is another one that's very popular. Every time I've taught this class, several students do St. Augustine's because it's easy and it's a big Catholic and it's college students, and that's all right. My only challenge to you is make sure that. Well, let me put it this way. I think the degree of difficulty is a little bit higher if you do one of these churches that 5 or 6 other people are going to do, because the question becomes, can you make it stand out? Maybe a better move, if you can, to try somewhere that's not going to be as popular. Now, some of you can't do that. You don't have a vehicle. The church is within walking distance, or your choices. Okay, make it work. You can do it. Just know in the back of your mind, if you're going to a St. Augustine's, or if you're going to Greenhouse, or if you're going to some of these other ones that are really popular, that you're not going to be the only one who visits there. So what you're going to have to do is make it so that yours stands out. Your observations are a little bit more insightful. You've done your homework. You've done your research on the church beforehand. That's what's going to set you apart, as opposed to someone who does not do those things. By the way, research. Don't go to these church visits cold. Do a little research on the church. Do a little research on the denomination they represent. If it's a non-denom like Greenhouse, then just research the church and see what type of tradition it comes out of. Know as much as you can going in, and it's going to help you know what to look for. It's going to make sure it's going to make your observations better. So I would definitely do that. And again, there's a detailed appendix on the syllabus, which is designed to help you and to answer questions for you. So anyway, I would use that. Week 11 today. So past couple weeks, we blitzed through church history, covered way too much in way too little time. Want to shift gears slightly. This is still historical, but this is more of a study of missionary. This is more of a study of culture clash. This is more of a study of how, and we touched on that in the last couple of weeks, but this brings it into the forefront in a way that is relevant not just in a church history sense, but also in a modern day sense. We're reading Silence. Now, you may know, well, obviously, this was turned into a major feature film last year. Martin Scorsese directed it. I haven't seen it. Quite frankly, it's on my list of films to see, but I haven't seen it yet. I will at some point. No, the movie's not going to be a good replacement for the book. It never is. It never is. And it's just not going to be able to give you everything the book's going to give you. So make sure to read it. Don't just say, I can watch the movie and that's enough. Read the book. I said part 1 of the syllabus, and some of you emailed and said, what does that mean? There's no parts. It means roughly the first half. But just make sure that you cover the translator's preface. I'm going to be explicitly looking for quiz questions from the translator's preface because it's really helpful. And it gives you a good picture of the history of it and gives you a good picture of Endo himself. So basically, part 1 is the translator's preface, the intro. Scorsese's got an intro, and the first half, roughly, of the book. Second half, next week is the second half. Why do I do that? I do that just to give you a little bit of leeway. Like if this week's nuts, then just do a couple chapters and make it up next week. Or vice versa. If next week's crazy, and you can see that it's going to be crazy, you have finals or other things happening, do the bulk of it this week so that you can take it easier on yourself next week. So that's why it's kind of a soft, mushy, in terms of what I'm looking for, but roughly the first half, and finish it by next week. So we're reading Silence, and Silence was written by a man named Shusaku Endo, Japanese Catholic writer, writing about 17th century Portuguese missionaries in Japan. I know that really sounds riveting. So why do I use this as a textbook for an Intro to Christianity class? Well, first of all, because it's a novel, and I like the idea of using creativity, using art, to teach Christianity, to teach any religion for that matter, because artwork is such a fundamental element of really all religious expression, and Christianity is certainly no different. There have been, we talked about Dante, maybe history's greatest poem ever, a direct result of his Christian faith. You want to talk about the most, as far as a fictional work, the highest selling fictional work of all time, Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan, allegory directly coming out of his Christian faith. We could talk about, we could talk about anything. We could talk about Chaucer, we could talk about Shakespeare, we could talk about all sorts of things and look for the Christian influences to be found there. Not to mention the works, the artistic works that are explicitly Christian. And silence falls into that category. So, art and, physical artwork, painting, obviously, and if you see any, the church architecture, that's obvious. Poetry. You think of people like T.S. Eliot comes to mind. Plays, again, Eliot comes to mind. Short stories with Flannery O'Connor, novels, Dostoevsky, and now you have silence written by a Japanese Catholic. So first of all, I just love the fact that we're using I try to use a novel in just about every class I teach, just specifically for that creative element. We are examining this not just with nonfiction, but we're also artistic expression and creativity. Now, this is fictional, but it's historical fiction, and it is very faithful historical fiction. It is definitely something where it's not too fanciful at all. A lot of this actually happened. So first, it's a novel. Second, it allows us to talk about a lot of interesting subjects, and I'm going to go through a few just to give you a sense of what to look for. Number one is the Jesuits. The main characters in this novel are Jesuits. Jesuits, we met them reading McGrath, and you can go back to page 149 and 150 in McGrath if you're stuck, but basically they come out of the Council of Trent, the Catholic Reformation. They are one of the religious orders that emerge, and they emerge with a drive to evangelize the world. They emerge they become known for their military energy. They definitely have a military air about them, but instead of fighting physical battles, they want to apply military energy and language to the battle, the spiritual battle, if you will, of global evangelism. They want to evangelize, they want to take over the world for Christ. And that takeover language, maybe you flinch at that a little bit, but they want to apply to global evangelism this military energy, this military organization and precision and energy, and just, this is the Jesuit. This is who they were. First Jesuit in Japan was a man by the name of Francis Xavier. If you've ever heard of Xavier University, which I believe is in the Cincinnati area, if I'm not mistaken. Famous figure, first Jesuit in Japan, 1549. The Jesuits live on to this day. Pope Francis himself actually comes out of the Jesuit tradition, which is pretty stunning if you know anything about Catholic theology and just the history of the papacy. So it's a major movement, comes out of the Catholic Reformation. We just got done talking about that, so I would refer you back to McGrath to get just a refresher on what the Jesuits were and what they stood for. But even beyond the Jesuits, they're an example of this, but more broadly, silence lets us talk about the missionary impulse. What would compel young men, and in this day, young women as well, to risk, that should be risk, sorry for the typo, to risk their lives so far from home? Silence is a story of two men from Portugal who travel on a boat for a very long time at risk of life and limb. They get to India and they get to Japan. Knowing that Japan is hostile to the Christian faith, knowing that they may well die in Japan. And as a matter of fact, they do. What would compel these young men, with their whole lives ahead of them, to make this journey? And again, it's not just silence. What compels the missionary impulse even to this day? In the Middle East, in countries that are quite hostile to Christianity, you still have Christian missionaries that are looking to get in there. You have missionaries going into inner cities. You have missionaries going all over the world. You have missionaries going into indigenous people groups, people that are a long way from quote unquote civilization, as missionaries to spread the gospel. Why would they do this? Well, there's a couple of different reasons. And most obviously, it's following the Great Commission, Matthew 28. The very end of the Gospel of Matthew, there's a very famous statement from Jesus that's come to be known as the Great Commission, where he says, "Go into all the world, making disciples and teaching everyone to obey everything that I've commanded you. So there is that direct mandate, the Great Commission, and missionaries take that mandate seriously. They always have, and they continue to do so. But you have that direct statement in the Bible, but even beyond that, the missionary impulse, in some ways, it's the outworking of taking Christian doctrine seriously, not least of which the doctrine of heaven and hell. Because the energy needed to sustain this missionary impulse, quite honestly, is strengthened and propelled, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes by a desire to take the doctrine of hell seriously. That if these people do not hear this message, and if they do not evangelize and become members of the Christian faith, then this is the fate that awaits them. Again, it's not to say that it's impossible to find Christian missionaries who have a more progressive view, a more metaphorical view of hell. I'm not saying it's impossible to find those people, because it's certainly not. But over the course of history, you find that this missionary impulse, these people that are willing to do this, they are going to be driven by more than just a metaphor. They're going to be taking hell as a serious they're going to be going and making this journey as an outworking of taking this doctrine seriously, saying this might be what befalls people. If they don't hear it, we have to go. We have to hear it. So you have this missionary impulse. The 19th century, the 1800s, was in some ways the quote-unquote golden age of the missionary era. You have people like William Carey making his way to India. You have the Western world, the global West, if you will, America and Europe, pumping out missionaries going all over the place, including places like Japan and the Middle East. It's funny because today the Western world receives more missionaries than it sends. It's gone inverted. It used to send missionaries to Africa and to Asia and other places. Now Africa and Asia send missionaries to the West, more so than reversed. It's just it's startling just how the fortunes of global Christianity, and we'll talk about global Christianity, but just startling how things have switched. The power center for global Christianity used to be in America, used to be in the West. I don't think you can, by any metric, maybe beyond money, but by any metric, I don't think you can say that anymore. That the power center of Christianity is in Western Europe and America. You got to look at South America. You got to look at Asia. You got to look at Africa. You got to look at China. House churches in China. Japan has a healthy Christian. It has a small Christian presence. But Africa and China and South America, these are the hotbeds. These are the places where Christianity continues to grow and flourish. It was a really big deal when Francis got elected Pope a few years back, because it was another sign, it was another symbol that the movement, the seat of power and the global Christian church used to be Europe and then America. I don't think you can say that by any metric anymore. I think when you look at Western Europe and you look at America, you look at places that are rapidly becoming post-Christian, where it's not the same level of vitality as these places that were formerly missionary targets, that were formerly places that missionaries went to. Now they are the places with the vitality and the energy. It's an interesting flip. But that missionary impulse, what is the drive to say, I'm going to leave my house, leave everything I've ever known, go to a foreign country and attempt to convert people to my religion there? It is fascinating, and it's one of the things that makes studying religion so interesting. The fact that it will propel people like this to do these really unbelievably radical actions. And silence gives us a little bit of silence is great because it lets us into the mindset a little bit of someone who has undertaken this journey and what they face and what their motivations are. Some of their motivations are beautiful and noble, some not so much, and that leads me to my next point. Silence lets us talk about not just the theology of the missionary impulse, but it also lets us talk about culture clash and territorial expansions. Lets us talk about colonialism and the struggle of East versus West. Missionaries played a role in that struggle. Some would say we're pawns in that struggle. But what you had is you had the intersection of missionaries on their journeys, global trade routes, and military power. So we're not just talking theology. We're talking how theology intersected with economics, with political, with politics, global politics, with power. Missionaries were agents of power, whether they tried to be or not. Just their position and who they were and where they were from. Colonialism is all about the ways in which the Western world leveraged its power against the non-Western world. Go read it. I'm sure you'll come across Edward Said at some point. He wrote literally wrote the book on this subject. But there really was this sense of power struggle that was intersecting with this missionary impulse. Missionaries represent their God, and they're there on behalf of their God, but they also are inevitably representing their nation and the entire Western world as well. It's not just, I am here to represent Christ in Japan. I am a white person from Europe who is here to represent Christ in Japan, and we must not lose to these infidels. We are the center of the universe. Our faith, we have faith in the one true religion. We are the harbingers of civilization. We are going to these quote-unquote barbaric people, these infidel people, and we are bringing this message that they need, and we are the only ones who can do it. And if we don't, if we fall away, if Japan defeats us, then not only have we failed in our missionary mission, but we have let down the honor, and we have besmirched the honor of the church, and the church, and the nations which the church inhabits. So it's not just a case of we're representing Christ, but in this case, in silence, we're representing Portugal, we're representing Europe, we're representing the Western world. So we can't lose. And you're going to see at the second half of the book how this idea of winning and losing really comes to fruition. But in the meantime, all I will say is that the drive of the missionaries was, we need to go do something that no one else can do, and we need to give these people something that they would never get otherwise. Now, there is another character, another group in Silence, which makes things particularly interesting, and that is the indigenous church. There is an indigenous Japanese church. They play a major role in the story. It's not just these two priests from Portugal, but it's also the indigenous Japanese believers. Watch the attitude of the priests towards the indigenous people. It's very fascinating. There is an element of imperialism here. We know what they need more than they do, and Christianity in Japan has no hope of survival in Japan without our presence, without our wisdom. There's nothing to believe that it would take root here without us. It's a very colonialist, very imperialist approach. It's also wrong. History has proven it wrong. China is a famous example of this. The Chinese house church is an interesting phenomenon. It's a fascinating phenomenon, actually. Because what you had is missionaries that were expelled. And the Western missionaries said, oh no, how is the faith going to survive without the presence of Western missionaries? Well, there's something called the house church movement, where indigenous Chinese believers not only survived, but flourished. And the Chinese house church movement became massive, enormous, and it was marked by life and vitality. And so the long answer to a short question, the faith in China did just fine without the Western missionaries. Thank you very much. But anyway, there is that tension. There is that sense of, all right, Western versus Eastern, and we're here, and we're representing Christ. And hey, there's indigenous people too. But in order for the faith to really stick here, we need to make sure that we're the ones that are doing it. So we have to come and save these poor infidels from themselves. That might be an overstatement, but not by much. So you definitely have that sense of imperialism and colonialism that's present. Silence lets us talk about persecution and suffering Christians. We've talked about this already with martyrdom. We're going to talk about it a little bit more because it's interesting, it's compelling, and it's just an add-on to what we've already mentioned. The Japanese nation in Silence treated their Christian citizens very cruelly, but it wasn't just cruelty for cruelty's sake. There was a reasoning. It was not without cause. They knew full well, and history bears this out, the threat of incoming missionaries stirring up natives, stirring up the indigenous people. They knew full well about religious conflicts, and they knew how religious actors could stir up revolutionary sentiment, where it's like, in the process of switching religions, then maybe we have a different take on our nationalism, maybe we have a different take on the people who run our nation, and maybe we want to overthrow them and bring someone else in. The translator's preface, I believe, mentions the Shimabara Rebellion in 1632, which seems to confirm the Japanese leaders' worst fears, because here you have Christians, Japanese Christians, basically attempting a form of mutiny, rebellion, wanting to overthrow the leadership. And the revolt, the rebellion, was marked as a Christian rebellion. So in their minds, all right, if we allow Christianity to come in, it'll turn our people against us, it will create political chaos, and it will undermine our nation. Better to exclude the missionaries, outlaw Christianity, and come down hard on anyone who professes this faith in our nation. And that's exactly what they did. This is the story that Silence tells. So you have these Japanese Christians, and they are absolutely caught in the middle, because they are Japanese. They are, this is their nationalistic idea. This is their ethnicity. This is their identity. They are Japanese citizens, but they also have committed to being Christian. A borrowed, and using Endo's own language there, a borrowed religious tradition. If Christianity was not seen as a Japanese religion, the Japanese religion was, if you're talking about Shintoism or something else, Christianity was seen as the outsider's religion, and we're still having this conversation today. There are Christian performers. It's funny, Christian rap and hip hop has really flourished in the past decade, I'd say. But the performers in that movement, people like Lecrae and KB and others, have mentioned that they have had people. They've been approached by people within their community, within the African American community, saying, "How can you worship the white man's God?" In other words, and if I find it, I'll post some links to show you precisely what I'm talking about. But it's not just that. Where you have the mark on Christianity is it is the white man's religion. It's it's a Western religion, which the ironic thing is historically that's not really true. But if you don't believe me, look at every single portrait of Jesus you've probably ever seen, and see if it's not someone who's as white as I am. See if it's a very Northern European Anglo Jesus. I've seen paintings of Jesus with bright blue eyes, pale white skin, blonde hair. And he's like, oh, Scandinavian Viking Jesus. This is not, it's not historical. We're talking about someone who is of Middle Eastern descent, someone who's a lot more brown than white, someone whose hair is a lot more black than blonde, someone whose eyes are a lot darker than someone with blue eyes. That's the history. But yet we get these portraits and these portrayals of Anglo lily white Jesus. Why is that? Well, I think some of it is kind of feeding back to this idea that Christianity is seen as the white man's religion. So for people like these Japanese Christians and others around the world even to this day, I guess maybe an analogy today would be maybe if you were in Saudi Arabia and you're a Christian. And even that's not a perfect analogy. But for these Japanese Christians in Silence, you have a borrowed religious tradition. You are dying. You are not considered a true citizen, and you are dying for this borrowed religious tradition. A little similar to what we found in the ancient Roman Empire in some ways, where it's like you're a Christian, therefore you cannot be a good Roman citizen. You are a threat to the state, and therefore you must be dealt with. Kind of a similar vibe going on. But there's a modern theological problem that's connected to this, and it's how is the life of a Middle Eastern man born 2,000 years ago applicable to everyone in history? How could this possibly be universal? We're talking about a man born in the modern day Middle East, who yet claims dominion over not just Jews, not just people from that region, but Europeans and Africans and Americans. And how is this possible? The short answer is it's possible because of the adaptability of Christianity. Christianity has proven itself to be phenomenally adaptive in the situation where it finds itself. The relationship between the religion itself and the people who claim it. Let me put it this way. Christianity looks different depending on where you are and when you are. African Christians worship very differently than American Christians do. And they worship differently than Indian, than Chinese, than Haitian. The list goes on and on and on. But part of that is the capacity of Christianity to adapt and to bear different distinctives depending on where it is. Now, the distinctives in America are have really, a lot of theologians and a lot of missiologists have been rather worried about the distinctiveness of Christianity in America, because Christianity planted in American soil becomes highly individualistic, highly focused on the individual, whereas more in African soil, for instance, it's a lot more communal, a lot more interested in the community or the family as a whole. It becomes consumeristic. God expresses his favor through monetary blessing, the quote-unquote health and wealth gospel. Whereas other locations, that's just not even conceivable. It's not a reality. It's interesting because Christianity really does adapt and it shifts without losing its essence, without losing the core of makes it what it is. It has shown itself able to adapt and to adjust and to bear a different look depending on the people who proclaim it and where they are and when they are. It's one of the reasons why 2,000 years later we're still talking about it. Because you do see this flexing, you do see the way it changes. But anyway, so what this adaptability does, though, it allows for this universal teaching. It allows for this universalism. It allows for the sense of if it's American Christians in 2017 or if it's Japanese Christians in the 16th century, there is a way for them to claim Christianity as their own. But with a borrowed religious tradition, it is inevitably more complicated. And these Japanese Christians find themselves caught in the middle. They are Christian, but if they were able to get on a boat and go to Portugal during this time, they would not be looked at as on the level with the Portuguese Christians that came to them. This is where colonialism comes into play. Or you have this idea of these differences that exist. So they are taught. They have a borrowed religious tradition. They have, and this is, and by the way, this is the author, Endo. This is his story. I mean, he's telling the story about the 16th century, but this is the story he's living in the 20th century. As a Japanese Catholic, these two traditions that have a lot that were often at odds with each other. He claims both. I am Japanese and I am Catholic, and I am trying to work out what the heck that means. This is Endo's story. This is what he's trying to do. This is where his writing comes from. So it makes it interesting, it makes it compelling, it makes it kind of not always comfortable, it makes it kind of uncomfortable in places. But this is the tension that Endo's wrestling with while he's writing, and it comes out in this beautiful expression of this book, Silence, which is captivating. It's been controversial. It's enjoyed a resurgence due to the fact that Martin Scorsese loved it enough to make it into a movie. But this is what silence gives us. Last thing, when it comes to silence and what it allows us to talk about, it allows us to talk about suffering. We talked about this already, but the technical term, it allows us to talk about theodicy. Where is God in suffering? And now we can talk about theology a little bit, because there's always been this tension. As far back as the book of Job, there's been this tension between suffering and God's presence. The long story short, if you are suffering, God is not with you. You must have done something to anger him and send him away. If you've ever read the book of Job in the Old Testament, even if you're not a Christian, I recommend it because it's one of the foremost pieces of just art that our culture was based on. But what happens with Job? And Job is the one who suffers. Job's friends come to visit him in the midst of his suffering, and this is essentially their message. Job, what have you done to make God hate you? Because if God didn't hate you, you wouldn't be suffering as you are. This is also, I mean, to make it a little bit more uncomfortable, this is also the message of the book of Proverbs. The book of Proverbs is very plain. If you do the right things, you will be rewarded. You will be blessed if you do the right thing. That's why you need other stories in the scriptures to, to balance that narrative out, to say, you know what, there is going to come a point where you've quote unquote done everything right, and you're still going to suffer. You're still going to wonder where the heck God is in all this. And that's Job's story. Job at the end says, where are you? But it's certainly not his alone. Where you have this sense of the righteous sufferer. Now, ultimately, in the Christian tradition, Jesus is the ultimate righteous sufferer. He is the one who truly did no wrong and suffered anyway. This is Isaiah 53 and whatnot. But you also have, this is a pattern that follows through Christian history, where you have people who are hurting and suffering going, where is God in the midst of my suffering? How am I doing this right? And again, this is a theological debate that carries on to this day, because like I mentioned, there's something called the health and wealth gospel, which is basically an extension of Job's friends, where it says, no, you're not doing something right. Obviously, you don't have enough faith, and if you just prayed harder, and if you just, and it's more cynical manifestations, if you just sent the man on the television some money in the name of faith, then all of your problems would go away, and you would have monetary blessing. God wants you to be rich. Some health and wealth preachers will just come out with it and say, God wants you to be successful, because if you're successful, it's a reflection on him. That's not biblical. That's not, I mean, it is a reading of Christianity, but it's a reading of Christianity that has a lot of problems. And Silence is just one of the books that show that, because especially with the Portuguese priests, but also the indigenous Christians, they do nothing to suggest that they are in divine disfavor, and yet they suffer horribly. The main character does nothing to suggest that he's out of God's favor, but suffers horribly and witnesses horrible suffering among Jesus' people, and people calling out to Jesus, and it's just, there's nothing. There's silence at the end of the line. What do you do with that? Silence attempts to wrestle with that, to come to a conclusion. The ultimate conclusion, I don't want to spoil too much, but the ultimate conclusion that it will come to is that the key is whence does peace come in the midst of suffering? It comes in solidarity with the suffering Christ. And that's going to be the main thrust of Silence, and I won't go any more detail than that. So that'll get you started. I hope you enjoy it. Like I said, don't just rely on the movie, read the book. But one more thing. I lied before. One more thing. Writing quiz questions on this. It can be tough to write quiz questions on a novel, because I still want true, false, multiple choice, and short answer. So how do you do that? Focus on major themes. This is true for all of them, but especially for Silence. Don't be tricky. Don't look for like minor details. Like, for example, the priest found Kichijiro in the town of Macau. Don't be tricky. That's tricky. Don't do that. Focus on the theology. Focus on the major themes that you see. Where it's faith in the midst of suffering, or it's the missionary impulse. I mean, things that are tied back to these major themes that that I want to talk about, rather than looking for obscure details in the plot. If you do that, then you'll be in great shape. But anyway, I think that's all I got for tonight. As always, holler if you have any questions or if you need anything. I'll probably do a video late next week, because I don't want to spoil it. I wanted to do this one as kind of a kickoff, like, hey, Silence, enjoy. I'll probably do the other one late next week after most people have read it, to kind of come back and say, all right, what'd you think? Let's talk. So you won't see a video right away from me next week, but there will be one that comes a little bit later, where I can talk about just kind of the what we learned in the reading experience. But I hope you enjoy it. And as always, if there's anything I can do to help you, let me know. Otherwise, have a lovely week.